So, Oscar Hammerstein II, born in 1895, and as I said, I would have told you before. You know, both he and Richard Rogers represent part of that second-generation Jewish immigrant establishment that largely defined American musical theater in the first part of the 20th century. I was doing a little bit of additional research to kind of get ready for this class, and discovered that although he is technically Jewish, Oscar Hammerstein, his grandfather, Oscar Hammerstein II, immigrated from Prussia in the 1860s and was of Jewish descent, and he married a young Jewish girl and raised a family, mostly secular Jews, the Hammersteins. But his father's family was Jewish, so some Jewish ancestry there. But actually, Oscar Hammerstein II, I did not know, was a baptized Episcopalian. So, and actually was raised, the first 5 years or so of his life were in Episcopal Sunday school, and then grew up at a pretty significant church in the Unitarian Universalist tradition. It was called the Church of the Divine Paternity. It became fourth Unitarian Universalist congregation in New York City. Nope, Susan, I'm not going to turn on my video quite yet. I want to just make sure that you can hear me, even if you can't see me. We'll try later on. But Oscar Hammerstein II was a Sunday school educated Unitarian Universalist. That's the tradition he grew up in. And actually, that tradition seems to have made an impact. There's a number of letters that he wrote to his son in the 1950s where he talks about some of those early religious influences and actually remembers a couple sermons that he heard at Church of the Divine Paternity when he was growing up. And that largely sort of served to define his sense, not so much of religion. Hammerstein would have said as an adult, I don't necessarily identify as a religious person, but does identify a lot of the tenets of universalism, which was the tradition in which he was really raised, as having shaped his take on the world. And actually, the church that he was raised at, Church of the Divine Paternity, was one of the kind of groundbreaking well, this is before Unitarians and Universalists became one denomination, but one of the groundbreaking Universalist congregations because of the ministers that served there, in particular, a guy called Charles Skinner, who was one of the probably most influential Unitarian Universalist ministers in the first half of the 20th century, bringing the principles of what we sometimes, what's called the social gospel movement. That's a phrase that some of you who know your American and Canadian Christian history, the social gospel movement was strong in Canada as well as in the US, a kind of way that liberal Protestants, so we're thinking about Congregationalists, UCCers, some Episcopalians, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Methodists, some more evangelical sects of Christianity, and some more liturgical parts of Christianity. A movement in those various denominations that really sought to understand the gospel as a social phenomenon. Understood it was not so much my personal salvation as it was bringing about the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. And that phrase became really key for social gospel folks, right? The Jesus project, if you like, was about bringing the kingdom of God to fruition on earth, not so much concerned with what happens in the afterlife with me and Jesus. So a little bit of a reaction against certainly Calvinism, a lot of what Calvinism, sinners in the hand of an angry God, right? This idea that God is the God of judgment and that if you misbehave, you go to hell. So social gospel movements is pulling away from that. And also this sort of a critique of American and Canadian and Western Christianity as being overly concerned with personal salvation and not sufficiently concerned with so Charles Skinner, who was Oscar Hammerstein II's pastor growing up, wrote a groundbreaking book. The kind of takeaway quote for him: it is evident that the philosophy of universalism, which is the tradition he's operating out of, implies social motive, he wrote, since from its beginning it has interpreted all life as being essentially good and the world as being capable of salvation. And that's significant, right? That for Skinner and for many of the social gospel folks, the world that we live in is the place where salvation happens. Salvation is not a function of an afterlife. It's the function of this world, us in the social sphere. So Skinner wrote, this belief is the true dynamic of social endeavor. Those who have faith in the world are the ones upon whom rests the tremendous responsibility of redeeming that world. And then he wrote, skepticism as to human nature cuts the nerve of social effort and causes paralysis of accomplishment. And that last line about the dangers of skepticism, in some ways that's not unique to Skinner, but distinctive to Skinner, but a phenomenon that I think we find very much reflected in the musical works of Oscar Hammerstein II. he's sometimes critiqued, I suppose, as being the most earnest of the Broadway lyricists, right? Hammerstein doesn't have a cynical bone in his body. The irony is that he partnered up with Richard Rodgers, who had been a composer who had worked for many years with Lawrence Hart. Hart was sort of famous for his caustic, brittle, witty, clever lyrics. And Rodgers and Hart developed a pretty successful partnership in the 20s and early 30s around this very sophisticated, urbane, pretty cynical view of human behavior, actually. And that then in the 40s, Rodgers, when his partnership with Lawrence Hart falls apart, teams up with this Unitarian Universalist social gospel guy who wears his heart on his sleeve, Oscar Hammerstein II, who is very interested in an almost sort of relentlessly positive understanding of human nature. You think about the sort of significant Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals, right? There is a full-throated embrace of human goodness, sometimes sentimentality. Oscar Hammerstein II is a lyricist who's not afraid to be sentimental when he needs to be, but earnestness and goodness and virtue and love, the redeeming power of love, affection. You think about some of the great heroines of Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals, right? Maria von Trapp, Nellie Forbush, Anna Leonowens in The King and I, right? These are women who wear their hearts on their sleeve, as Oscar Hammerstein II did, love children, sing with children. I mean, there's a reason this guy wrote Climb Every Mountain and Do Re Mi and The Sound of Music, right? Nature is a sphere of the divine for Hammerstein. Love is where divine happens. He's not a cynical man when it comes to human goodness. He believes in the power of human goodness to bring about certainly social change, but also a kind of, I want to argue, a kind of secular redemption. Hammerstein thinks that we can be redeemed as human beings when we learn how to love, when we learn how to love nature. That would probably be the closest thing to a divinity in Hammerstein's world. And many of his kind of great songs, we think about Old Man River, but all the way through to The Sound of Music and Climb Every Mountain, right? These are songs that really draw on the imagery of nature as being the most potent source, if you like, of thinking about God. Old Man River, he must know something. He don't say nothing, he just keeps rolling along, right? The image of the river as the constant there. Climb every mountain, ford every stream, follow every rainbow till you find your dream. That is the quintessential Oscar Hammerstein lyric. And that full-throated embrace of human goodness was, I think, largely shaped when he was growing up in Sunday school. He really is a product of the early 20th century social gospel movement and is bringing those ideas to a Broadway stage in some really interesting ways. And nowhere do we really see that, the social aspect, the social justice aspect of the social gospel movement than in a show like South Pacific, which is where I want to start tonight. Rodgers and Hammerstein had written 2 successful shows prior to South Pacific and 1 show that tanked. So Oklahoma and Carousel have opened to great acclaim. They're still touring and are playing on Broadway, actually. They opened a show called Allegro, which is sort of a notorious flop. Stephen Sondheim, who was kind of mentored by Oscar Hammerstein II, later said, many, many years later, my whole career I've been trying to fix the second act of Allegro. I don't think he ever managed to do that, but it was a significant show for Stephen Sondheim and a significant kind of going back, I think, for Rodgers and Hammerstein. Why doesn't the show work? How can we make it work? They kept tinkering with Allegro and never were able to make it work. But kind of coming off of the flop of Allegro, we're made aware of James Michener's Pulitzer Prize-winning book of short stories, Tales from the South Pacific. They actually read it, I think, before it was published, but optioned it very quickly. The book, a lot of people were saying, this is a book that probably can't be made into an effective musical because it's kind of disconnected, character-driven short stories. There's not a plot to Tales of the South Pacific other than a kind of loose plot. And Hammerstein is the one who read the book, loved the book, and convinced Rodgers, I can make a musical plot out of these stories. So the story of South Pacific is really Oscar Hammerstein's culling, editing, collection of kind of his riff on what Michener is doing in Tales from the South Pacific. He takes one of the, not a minor character, but one of the kind of through characters in the Michener book, Nellie Forbush, and uses her sort of as his heroine. Nellie is really the key figure in the story. And unlike the kind of Broadway conventions at that time, where you would have the main love story, the serious love story, and then the comic love story, right? Think about Oklahoma, right? You've got Laurie and Curly; they're the main love story, and then you've got Addo Annie and Allie and Will. Oh, his name has just gone out of my head. It's not Will Rogers. the other guy, the cowboy, the comic love story. That was sort of that was the way that Broadway worked, right? You had your main love story, your comic love story, and South Pacific jettisons that idea for two serious love stories. It's actually a pretty, there's a lot of fun in South Pacific, but Hammerstein is writing with a little bit of an agenda. Rogers not so much. Rogers and later would kind of downplay the social mission stuff in South Pacific. We might look at a quote later where he actually talks about the song "You've Got to Be Carefully Taught" and says, "Oh no, that song is not meant to be a sermon. It's a character piece. It's in the mouth of Joe Cable as he's faced with this wrenching moment in his life. But it was never meant to be a sermon. It was never meant to be a statement of social principle. We wrote it as a character piece for a character we created." Hammerstein had a very different sense of that song and of that character and of that show. He had gone through, during the Second World War, his brother-in-law, who's Japanese, had been interred at Ellis Island as part of the Japanese internment that was happening in the Second World War. People of Japanese descent being rounded up, and I don't think he wasn't quite imprisoned, but he was definitely being held at Ellis Island. So his wife, who was Hammerstein's wife's sister, and their two biracial children moved in with the Hammersteins. And the Hammersteins took them to the local school down the road. Are these two kids who are half American, half Japanese, are they going to be treated okay in the school? And they were turned away. So interracial marriage, the phenomenon of having a very personal exposure to Japanese Americans being treated very badly by his country, but particularly the kind of the difficulties inherent in a biracial marriage, a cross-cultural marriage, was a personal experience for Oscar Hammerstein. And that seems to be one of the significant life experiences, maybe perhaps the most significant life experience, that led him to fixate on Tales from the South Pacific. And really, I mean, the Michener novel is not nearly as direct, shall we say, in its portrayal of casual American racism and the challenges inherent in it as Hammerstein's script is. He wrote the book to South Pacific. The script is his script. The lyrics are his lyrics. And it's much more direct. I want to argue that South Pacific is in some ways probably the closest we get to Oscar Hammerstein's social theology. So I want to look at, he and Rogers performed You've Got to Be Carefully, or introduced You've Got to Be Carefully Taught as part of the Week for Christian Unity in 1952. This is a couple years after South Pacific. South Pacific was a huge success on Broadway, hugely commercial successful, one of the longest running shows of its time, open to rave reviews, made a ton of money, was a difficult show to get a ticket to, the hot ticket on Broadway, hugely successful. A couple years later, it's still touring around the country. The cast album has sold a gazillion copies. It's a cultural phenomenon. They know it's a cultural phenomenon. The song You've Got to Be Carefully Taught already, I mean, from the get-go, was controversial. There was an attempt in the state of Georgia to ban it. Not so much because, I mean, the stated reasons were not because it purports to identify racism and sort of the insidiousness of racism. The stated reasons for You've Got to Be Carefully Taught being a problem were that it was infiltrating communism. This is, of course, 1952, right? So the Red Scare is live everywhere. McCarthyism is going great guns. And You've Got to Be Carefully Taught was seen as an effort. I suspect there's some not very well hidden anti-Semitism at work here too, right? These two purportedly Jewish guys. Hammerstein was largely seen as Jewish, even though he had been raised by Unitarians. But these two Jewish guys from New York, trying to push their liberal values on the fine red state of Georgia, and that was McCarthyism, right? That was communism. That was Marxism trying to sneak in by the back door. So there was an attempt in the Georgia legislature actually to have any artistic material that seemed to promulgate the ideas of communism be banned, and they were talking about South Pacific. South Pacific was getting ready to open in Atlanta. There was an attempt to have it banned. So but particularly around that song, You've Got to Be Carefully Taught is really as direct as Hammerstein gets in terms of diagnosing the problem. And the scene actually out of which it comes is a really interesting scene. In the clip I'm going to show you, he explains a little bit, Oscar Hammerstein explains a little bit the context of the song, which I think is important. So let's let him tell us about his song.
The National Conference of Christians and Jews have the help of Richard Rogers at the piano and Oscar Hammerstein in setting the mood of Brotherhood Week with one of their famous tunes.
In the second act of South Pacific, a young American Navy nurse explaining her race prejudice says, I can't help this. This is emotional. It's born in me. And the second character, the man who is losing her because of this prejudice, shouts his protest. I do not believe this. I do not believe these things are born in you. And a third character, a young Marine lieutenant, played by my friend here, Bill Tabbert, says,
It's not born in you. It happens after you're born. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught.
That's You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. Hammerstein sketches the context out of which the song comes, which I think is really significant, right? This is the moment where Nellie is confronted by Emil, who she's fallen in love with. She's met his 2 biracial children. When she first sees them, she doesn't realize they're Emil's, and she says, "Oh, aren't they adorable? Look at those cute black eyes," right? Kind of fetishizes them a little bit, these cute kids. When she realizes they're Emil's children, and more significantly that Emil has had a relationship with a Polynesian woman. Actually, in the original script of South Pacific, when Nellie realizes that they're Emil's, and she says, "Was her mother?" and Emil says, "Polynesian." And in the script, Nellie immediately says, "Oh, colored." And in previews, they cut the line because Josh Logan, the director, says nobody's going to accept Mary Martin saying the word colored. That's too, like, Mary Martin is America's sweetheart and casually racist. The line has been restored, actually, when it was done on Broadway in 2008 or something like that with Kelly O'Hara, another America's sweetheart. She said the line, and it got a gasp from the audience, right? How can sweet, innocent Nellie be that casually racist? But I think that's Hammerstein's point, right? Nellie actually, in some ways, is this really interesting character. Is when she's confronted with Emil, she's sobbing, right? And she says, "I can't give you a good answer for this. It's emotional. It doesn't make any sense to me, but it's so deep in me. It's something I can't change. It's emotional." And then she runs away. And Emil turns to Cable, right, who Nellie kind of tried to enfranchise. Like, why do you say this? Why do you good, upstanding American boys and girls claim that this is born in you in this sort of wrenchy, like you wish you could get over it? And that's when Cable says, no, not so. And that's Hammerstein speaking, right? Like, this is not inevitable. Racism, maybe to a certain degree, like now we know a little bit more about kind of how the kind of genetics of seeing difference and what that does to our amygdala. Scientists are now saying, yeah, there are some genetic components to seeing difference and how our brain processes difference. But that's not the same thing as saying that racism is inevitable. And Hammerstein would say, if you've been carefully taught to hate, you can also be carefully taught to undo some of that training. So what are your reactions to this? Is this a redemption story? Is Nellie on a journey that takes her to a place of at least some kind of redemption? Or is this show still kind of caught in what we might call a sort of white savior complex? Because there's some underlying problems as much as there's beautiful stuff in South Pacific. I'm curious as to your thoughts about Nellie and Lieutenant Cable, and what the show has to say about the inevitability of racism or how we work to unteach ourselves.
I mean, I think it's also, just to hop in while folks think about it, it's important to remember this is a war story. And so not only are we encountering Nellie Forbish's kind of latent racism, But we're also in a time when Nathan mentioned the Japanese internment of North Americans, both in Canada and in the US. Japanese, Canadians, Americans were sent away for long periods of time. So I have a little bit of sympathy for Nellie, because at that point in the Second World War, and some of you may probably remember some of these years, the enemy was racialized. That's what I'm wanting to say. And there was a kind of not trusting anybody whose eyes are oddly made, to pick another line from Hammerstein's Carefully Taught. So it's also a war story, but yeah, who else wants to come in here?
It's fascinating. I knew nothing about this background of Hammerstein, and it's reading books recently about Thurgood Marshall and some of the battles that he fought, and then to hear that Hammerstein was so sensitive to these racial problems it's fascinating, frankly. And I know it would probably take you off task, but I wonder, I had not heard the information or the idea of the amygdala in our brain.
The amygdala, yeah. So, I mean, it's a little bit of this is a little off topic, but in some ways, this is a live question for us today, not in the context that Hammerstein was dealing with it, right? Where the idea was, when Hammerstein was confronting scientific racism, which he was confronting the idea that biologically, people of dark skin are genetically different from people with white skin. And then based on that supposition, right, you can begin to create hierarchies of races, which scientists did, right? That race was biological. We now know that's not the case, right? That genetically, actually, I share a lot more genes with somebody. I mean, Africa is the most genetically diverse continent that exists. And that all of us genetically are African, right? Like that's where all human genetics can trace our origins back. The idea of white skin is a pretty, whiteness is the most newest of the races, if you like. All of us at some level genetically are African. So we know that genetically, right, like racism is not a function of our genes, it's not a function of our biology. And that was a controversial question in Hammerstein's day. So in some ways, he's responding to that definition of scientific racism, right? Nellie's saying, basically, this is biological in me. I'm just genetically a racist. And Hammerstein's saying, no, that's not true. But there is now some kind of interesting discussion around how human programming in our brains, right, how we've been conditioned to see difference and to fear it, right? The idea is that the amygdala in the brain, which is the fear sensor in the brain, is activated. I think this is not entirely it's not all the kinks of this unworked out. There are some people who say, maybe racism seems to be both a function of our brain training, if you like, and also a function of our teaching, our environment. It's a complex phenomenon that has some brain chemistry stuff to it, and quite a bit of social training. So it's once again kind of a live conversation for us. Hammerstein coming down very firmly on that this is a learned behavior. There's nothing, you get no excuses by virtue of having a brainstem that is programmed in a certain way. That is no excuse for Nellie saying, I can't continue in this relationship with you because of your previous relationship with a Polynesian woman. Hammerstein says she doesn't get off that easy, and the song is in some ways designed to kind of make that point.
Yeah, Pam, do you want to come in? You made some comments about Nellie Forbush as a strong and attractive white woman in the midst of all of this.
I watched the 1958 movie version of South Pacific with Rosanna Grazzi
and Mitzi Gaynor.
And Mitzi Gaynor. And, at first I didn't realize quite what I was feeling, but it was just obvious sexism that was, that you sort of anticipated in that period of time. But what happened is that she became sort of infantilized, as white women, attractive white women were. So so it sort of took away her sense of authority over her judgment. It was almost, sometimes it was displayed almost as if, of course she would say this, of course she would believe this, because she's just this poor little white lady from, from the United States.
In the two soliloquies, the piece that DeBeck and Nellie Forbush sing, she sings about herself. He's a cultured Frenchman. I'm a little hick.
Right.
And there's this sort of self-deprecating thing that's going on when, and infantilized certainly as the nurse with all the sailors for whom there's nothing like a dame, complete objectification of women.
I think it's worth pointing out the blind spots that are still at work. I mean, South Pacific also traffics in some pretty cringe-worthy racial stereotypes, right? Bloody Mary is not I mean, that's a tricky character to stomach. She's pretty based in mid-century stereotypes around a Polynesian, Tonkinese actually is what she is. And the kind of very uncomfortable scene where they visit Bali High and there's this whole tribal boar's head ceremony thing happening, and you think, what is this? This is a weird kind of primitivism. So, Rogers and Hammerstein are not, they are creatures of their time and have the blind spots that they have, as I do, as you do. We all have our blind spots. And yet are onto something really interesting, I think, in this, in a show that is as complicated as it is, yet really trying to move in a particular sort of direction. But as you say, Pam, Nellie can be a tricky vehicle for that redemption to come through because of the way the show treats her. She can be kind of written off, and sometimes the show kind of does treat her with a sort of she's a character of silliness and fun. Sometimes it's hard to take Nellie seriously, and I think that's a fair critique of the show. Yeah, Barb says the way Bloody Mary spoke was very uncomfortable. Bloody Mary played incidentally by an African-American actress, Juanita Hall. So she's in some kind of weird makeup that's trying to make her look vaguely Asian. An amazing actress, actually, who mostly played like Chinese and Vietnamese characters, at least in Rogers and Hammerstein musicals, which is another sort of weird example of mid-century representation that nobody probably gave a second thought to in the time. And now we say, it's an interesting choice of casting, but there it is.
Also, just kind of interesting to note, since you've raised it, Pam, the evolution that I see in the trajectory of the plays of the musicals of Rogers and Hammerstein, from Laurie in Oklahoma and Nellie in South Pacific, and then we get Anna in The King and I, and Maria in The Sound of Music, who are both very strong women, standing up against men and claiming their own place. Now, unfortunately, they are both defined by their relationships with men, with Maria, obviously, with Captain Von Trapp, and Anna with the King, but way more self-assertive, self-actualized, stronger, feminist-oriented women as the works of Rogers and Hammerstein evolve and emerge through the years.
Some of you may, I'm curious. One of my questions with South Pacific is how was this show received when it how aware were audiences in 1952 when this show was such a phenomenon of what was being said? And some of you, I suspect, probably grew up with this cast album and have a history with this show. And I'm curious, was the kind of overt, we might say, preachiness of Hammerstein's show, was that something that you picked up on? It was not, really, when I first encountered the show as a kid. And I'm wondering if I was just like unaware of it, or if maybe that's something that we see with a different lens now in 2020 that maybe we didn't see 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Go ahead, Susan.
South Pacific premiered on Broadway in '49. And it makes sense to me that people would have been listening to the music and watching the performance, and nothing wouldn't have disconnected. And 1900 plus shows, and then a movie, it fits into the times. And interesting, isn't it, that the controversy was of the time as well, with Georgia trying to not have it run there.
I think in part it was popular because it was so timely, because of the Second World War, and because the Second World War was as in everybody's face on a daily basis as COVID-19 is today for us. It was the crisis of the time. And so to have a musical about something that wasn't from the distant past, nor a fantasy like Oklahoma, nor a kind of bizarre French adapted story like Carousel, but yikes, South Pacific. Here we had a show that was dealing with something as contemporary as tomorrow's newspaper. And even by the time the film came out in the early 60s, in many, many people, all adults, living memories, was the Second War. And I think it took a while. Certainly, one of the incidents from my childhood, I remember, I'll do it quick. Our next door neighbor's daughter, when I was about 6 or 7, chose a Caucasian family, and she fell in love with and married a Japanese Canadian. And the day of her wedding, she left the house. Her parents stayed in the backyard and refused to go to the wedding because they could not imagine their daughter married to someone who wasn't a white Canadian. And the pain of that moment, I mean, I remember it still, it resounds in my soul. It seemed like a reasonable objection at the time in my young mind in about 1962. People have to be careful, and this interracial marriage thing, just being fully disclosing. And of course now it just seems like, oh my God, I can't believe they actually did that. So so I kind of understand from a very visceral level, Nellie Forbush's shock that this cultured Frenchman was married to a Polynesian. And I think that would be the shock for the audiences in 1945. The morality, the issues of racism would kind of emerge out of reflection about all of that.
Kathy, you've got your hand up, and then Barbara.
I grew up with the album, the original cast Broadway album, and played it over and over again. And for me, it was an anthem of what is right. It was, what didn't feel preachy. It felt like, this is the way things are supposed to be, and God and country or something.
Yeah.
Same thing when I later saw the movie. It was just, was thrilling to see the movie after listening to the album.
Hammerstein's lesson was not lost on you. He would be so pleased to know that.
No, I love all of Hammerstein's lyrics. They're just so positive and so, I love them.
Yeah. Barbara Brecht, you want to jump in?
I'm exactly with that. I can remember at 7 and 8 years old, I fell in love with Bloody Mary. She's still one of my favorite loves in my life. And Emile and all the exotic people, they were so wonderful. And all these other things that were happening. And at 7 and 8, and in those days you went home for lunch and you could play on your stereo Broadway musical. And that was South Pacific. And actually for me, they helped introduce me to the interest in the other far more than Nellie Forbush and all the others.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and that's actually a great bridge to the question I want to think about. To kind of think about how these musicals do, I think, especially when we respond to them, they do reflect back at us experiences that feel very personal. And that scene between Nellie and Joe Cable, where they're right, kind of leading up to the song, right? Like he confesses to her, I'm in love with this girl. I don't think I can marry her. And Nellie says, of course you can't. I understand. And she says, yeah, I'm having trouble with Emile too. And she says to him, Joe, you're a long way from home. We both are. And Nellie's sense is too much, right? I'm ready to go back home. Joe's ready to stay, actually. He sort of says, no, this is kind of where I want to be. But I'm curious if that's an experience that resonates with you. When have you been in a moment where you realized, oh, I'm a long way from home? And in some ways, both Cable and Nellie have a choice in that moment, right? I can choose to push through what I have been carefully taught and maybe work at unteaching myself some of that stuff, or I can choose the place of safety. I can choose to go back to Little Rock, Arkansas, where I will not be challenged in this way. I'm curious if that's a experience that resonates with you, or if there's been a moment in your life, or maybe a series of moments, that you can connect with Nellie or with Cable around something like that. I'm going to send you into small groups to talk about experiences in our life where we're asked to grow up a little bit. And sometimes growing up means we have to unthink some of the stuff we've been carefully taught. So turning from being carefully taught and how we overcome some of that teaching to some of the blind spots, we might say, that are inherent in some of this work. And I want to submit to you that the social gospel movement, which was largely a function of liberal white Protestants, we're going to include Oscar Hammerstein in that collection, there were as many blind spots to there was a sort of a missionary impulse in the social gospel movement that sometimes could be a little bit problematic. And in many ways, as those of us who are the inheritors, in many ways, the social gospel movement really shaped certainly contemporary Episcopal culture, and I would argue probably Anglican culture as well. There's the kind of progressive arm of our mainline Protestant denominations has been largely shaped by the social gospel movement. And in some beautiful ways, and also in some tricky ways. We're going to look at the King and I and the phenomenon of the white savior. And I hand it over to my colleague, Peter Elliott, to introduce that to us.
Thank you. One of the things I need to learn from my friend Nathan LeRud is how to talk faster to get everything in. And so I'll do my very, very best. Today from one of my coaching clients that Metropolitan Vancouver, this is both for my Canadian friends and our US friends, Metropolitan Vancouver is now 49% non-white. And I found that astonishing, actually. But when I think about my experience of life here, it is increasingly of living within a very culturally diverse region. So I know in the US, the issues of race and so forth are front and center, but just to assure you that north of the border, especially in the metropolitan cities, we are living, and one of the things I said to my coaching client was, we can't say we anymore, as if it refers to a majority, right? And so anyway, I'm gonna go back to my time in Sunday school in the Niagara region of Southern Ontario. We stood in the parish hall as Sunday school children in the early 1960s, boys in our suits and ties, girls in skirts and dresses, and together we'd solemnly sing together a missionary hymn like this one. From Greenland's icy mountains, from India's coral strand, where Africa's sunny fountains roll down their golden sand, from many an ancient river, from many a palmy plain, they call us to deliver their land from error's chain. Both the hymnals of the Anglican Church of Canada and the Episcopal Church included this text and a whole lot of others in a section called missionary hymns. From the Canadian context, missionary work was an expression of British colonialism. Religion was a key ingredient in the toolbox that brought British education, law, culture, and governance to North America. And sadly, also British food, but that's for another course sometime. Canada was a colony of the British Empire formally until 1980. So that's our experience. In the US and Canada, vestiges of colonialism continue. The attitude toward the non-Christian folks was that they were to be delivered, as the hymn put it, from error's chains. The world was easily divided into the saved and the heathen. And it was way better to be part of the saved, because at least then you got to go to heaven. colonizing nations, planting the flag and claiming the land for their conquerors is rooted in the doctrine of discovery dating back to 1100. This doctrine, promulgated first through papal bulls and then included in legal systems, established a spiritual, political, and legal justification for the seizure of land. This doctrine has particularly affected indigenous people, as their sovereignty was ignored and colonizers brought their assumptions about the world onto their lands, displacing them and replacing indigenous wisdom with the right ways of knowing from the conquerors. It's into this reality that we encounter the world of The King and I. Anna Leon Owens, on whose memoir this musical is based, was born in 1829, and this is an interesting factoid, in Bombay, India. Her father was English. Her mother, the daughter of a British Army officer in India, likely married to an Anglo-Indian woman whose name is never recorded. Anna, therefore, despite Gertrude Lawrence, Kelly O'Hara, all the pretty white actresses who play her on Broadway, has a very complicated heritage. Likely she is of mixed race. She, when she was asked to say where she was from, she always said Wales, which might as well be from Wales if you're English and maybe not totally English. Anyway, she was formed in the world of colonialism. That's the point. What I find really fascinating is the actual map that she shows the kids when she pulls down the map that we're familiar with. It's a map that would be immediately recognizable to Canadians of a certain generation, because every country that's part of the English Empire in it is in pink. It became pink because they wanted, the English wanted to put it in red, but they couldn't reproduce maps with the names of the countries on it in red. So they kept making the color less and less intense until it became pink. So Canada is in pink, South Africa, Kenya, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera. It was where the empire went, so did its religion go. And in Canada, this had tragic consequences as the indigenous inhabitants of this land were regarded as the heathen, and every effort was spent to assimilate them into the norms and values of British culture. This included a system of residential schools, and we'll talk about this in a couple weeks, where indigenous children taken from their homes were forbidden to speak their languages and were sadly very often the victims of sexual and physical abuse, in addition to the cultural abuse that was at the root of the system. In The King and I, we see this effort of saving those oh so cute but unfortunate, ignorant, heathen children with the enlightened insights from the British Empire. Of course, Anna's motivation is good, but the impact of this white woman wanting to save the world was replicated in circumstances all around the world, near and far, leading to a legacy of colonial power that continues to be with us to this very day. So how well did Anna fulfill the promises of getting to know you? Did she really get to know all about the wonderful culture she came into? Did she discover, to take the name of another great song, the great anthem of The King and I, something wonderful? Did she discover something wonderful about the polygamous king and his arbitrary use of power and privilege? While she sought to change the world she encountered through education, to what extent was she changed? And to what extent did her experience lead her to challenge the assumptions of colonialism? And from there, just to jump to a couple other questions. What maps of the world do we carry around in our minds? Where is it that we as white people think we've got it figured out? What can we learn from Mr. Anna, as she's referred to, about the process of getting to know others and discovering something wonderful and different? And to pick up on the theme of the course, how do we understand the theological concept of redemption in the light of racism? If redemption means, as I suggested last week, being kept free from evil and morally improved, what is required, particularly of white people, in the context of race relations? I wonder if the concept of kenosis, or self-emptying, that St. Paul articulates in Philippians 2, when he talks about how Christ did not count equality with God as something to cling to, the way Christians of a certain generation clung to the idea that the world could be divided into heathens and believers. But as Paul continues, Christ emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. What might it mean to empty ourselves of assumptions about others who, as Hammerstein put it, have skins of a different shade, and learn about how the holy is revealed in so many diverse ways? So I'm interested, maybe Nathan, first back to you, about Anna and a character and what she represents now when we look at her through the lens of colonialism and racism.
Yeah, and I'm curious as to all of your thoughts too, especially given some of our conversation a little bit earlier around Nellie Forbush and the way that in some ways she gets a little bit infantilized in South Pacific. Anna is presented as a slightly older, more mature woman, but a big piece of the missionary content that she is bringing to the people of Siam is not full of mid-century feminism in a certain kind of way. Anna is less a creature of the 1860s and more a creature, I would argue, of the 1950s. Her fixation is on a house, right? She is insistent that the king make good on his promise to give her a house. And that has to do with her sense of empowerment. A woman, in some ways, what she's looking for is a room of her own, if we're going to borrow a phrase from Virginia Woolf, that she is coming into this culture with some maybe ahistorical ideas about the role of women vis-a-vis Victorian society. We can question whether a woman in 1862 would really have been able to say the kinds of things that Anna says. But certainly by 1950, this is an articulation of Western womanhood that was beginning to have some traction, right? These are women who are beginning to find their voice. And in many ways, that's a big piece of what Anna is seeking to bring to the wives and the children of Siam. She takes an interest in Tup Tim, this enslaved woman who is in love with a man she shouldn't be, and eventually is beaten, tortured, basically, by the king, and Anna tries to intervene. She takes an interest in Lady Chiang, the king's kind of chief wife, and they have this kind of interesting back and forth around what is it to be a woman in relationship to a powerful man. But many of the values that Anna articulates and seeks to bring to the people of Siam are ones that I suggest many of us are very sympathetic to, and yet, looking at the distance that we're looking at, I think we're also beginning to see that part of her assumptions blind her to the very real damage that she is doing, can do, as a European white woman coming into a world that she does not understand. And I'm curious, how do we respond to that tension that Roger and Hammerstein give us between a woman whose motives we can sympathize with, perhaps, but also whose way of going about it, I think we're beginning to see, is increasingly problematic in a show that traffics in some increasingly problematic stereotypes around non-Western people. Thoughts about The King and I? Did some of you get a chance to watch it this week? How does it strike you 50, 60 years after it first premiered?
When Nathan and I were chatting about this earlier this week, we were commenting on or noticing in the various productions that go around the racial diversity that is employed to make a stage full of Thai children. Siam is obviously Thailand. And so you end up with sort of a Pan-Asian group. And most of the actors who play the king, I'm not sure, it'd be interesting to look whether there's ever been a Thai actor who's played the king in The King of... Yul Brynner was Russian, I think, who made the role great. And Ken Watanabe, who was with Kelly O'Hara in the most recent revival, is Japanese. So it's interesting, just that kind of cultural diversity. Nathan, you're probably watching who's got some comments here and call them in.
Yeah, I'm seeing some good thoughts in the chat. Grace says it has echoes of the white man's burden, and that's very much the Kipling poem that in many ways kind of exemplifies that particular approach to 19th century colonialism. I want to see the missionary impulse right next door to the social gospel, the sort of upper middle class white liberal establishment mid-century that also sought to bring a different kind of gospel to the benighted masses in ways that have shaped many of us as contemporary Western white liberals, and I think that we're being challenged on now. In some ways, these are very live issues. When The King and I was revived on Broadway, there was a pretty significant pushback. A lot of people saying the stereotypes that this show traffics in are no longer appropriate. This show needs to be retired. And the production team, Bartlett Sher and Kelly O'Hara and Ken Watanabe and others said, no, actually, this show is more contemporary than it has ever been. That tension, I think, really lies at the heart of this piece of theater. But certainly it's one that I think that we're asked to really wrestle with. When we have strongly held convictions about what is right in the world, where do my convictions end when I seek to impose them on someone who I may not fully understand because they are different than me? How do I separate out the beauty of seeking to improve, bring the gospel, however I understand it, to the world, from a kind of cultural imperialism?
I think it does reveal some of the issues of imperialism, of us assuming that our culture is better and going into a whole group of cultures. And was this the same time as the woman who wrote The Ugly American? I can't think of her name. She was well known from Philadelphia. We talked about, us going in and thinking we know what's right for a country.
Yeah, I don't know that reference, but that's certainly what's happening in The King and I, right? Anna is just sort of blithely assuming that Western values of egalitarianism and sexual gender parity, she brings a pretty heavy agenda against slavery, right? And the show is almost uncritically behind Anna, right? This is a show for 1950s American audiences, and it's in some ways it's less my sense is it's less a show about English values, and very much in some ways a show about American values, North American values, we might say, going to Siam in ways that are tricky, right? Although she intervenes to stop a slave being beaten. It's hard not to sympathize with Anna in that point, right? It's horrific what the king is about to do to Tuptim. And yet it's presented to us in the context of a woman who really is not really seeking to, she's saying, I'm getting to know you. Well, is she? Is she really seeking to understand the king? Or is she seeking to change the king and make him into her image of what kingship needs to be?
One of the things that presents a conflict for me personally is that, not about the racial issues, but because in that era, she would seem like a strong woman.
Yeah.
Here she is, a widow with her son, going out to do something. And for me, as a little girl watching that was pretty powerful.
Yeah.
The women become stronger and stronger in Hammerstein until end up with Maria von Trapp, who is depicted as such a strong woman. And there's also these three anthemic songs in Carousel, Of Course You'll Never Get Alone, which they do sing at Unitarian Universal Churches as the offertory hymn. It's sung there. In The Sound of Music, Climb Every Mountain, and in The King and I, this beautiful, I think one of the most achingly beautiful melodies that Richard Rodgers wrote, Something Wonderful, which is, kind of saying to Anna, he may not always say what you'd want to hear, but every now and then he says something wonderful, and the strains of that come up at the end when he's lying on his deathbed, and at the best, what I'd hope for is that our listening ears, especially when we encounter diverse cultures, when we encounter people who don't look like us, is to listen for something wonderful things, some new insights, as opposed to the assumption that we have that we white folks have the insights to bring others.
A couple of interesting thoughts in the comment. Cynthia says, you don't have to go abroad to have this experience. The American Indian schools are a good example. And that's actually why I wanted us to hear the whole clip with that kind of weird English school anthem at the beginning, right? We da 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 at the Royal Bangkok Academy. English words are all we speak at the Royal. And then she stops them and says, I can't hear you. You need to articulate that better. And for those of us who know the experience, I mean, certainly the Canadian experience of residential schools, but we're not strangers to that experience in Oregon either. Many of you know that we had residential schools very close to Portland, and English words were all that were spoken. That moment, which I think is presented in the show, in the context of the show, as a sweet moment of, oh, look at these funny Asian people singing these English kind of school hymns, and isn't this sweet and isn't it endearing? It sits much more much more uncomfortably with me, thinking about how near to the American experience a character like Anna is, and how much damage has been done in our very own context in the Pacific Northwest by white saviors, well-intentioned, doing kind of cultural damage to Native tribes that they were not really seeking to understand. It's a tricky legacy that I think we wrestle with, and it shows up in A King and I in some really uncomfortable ways.
We're still doing it to this day. I was in Thailand last year, right before the coronation of the new king, who is widely disliked, but you can't bring that up. And the North American and a lot of European, I don't know if you know, but they had a rushed wedding right before the coronation, where he married his principal wife, who was, I think, his third wife. And North American media mostly showed her on the ground with her head below him, lying completely prostrate. But the picture was only ever shown from one angle. And if they showed it from the other angle, which the BBC did, you would see that all of the ministers were also on the floor, prostrate in front of the king. But we chose to show only the bride and basically went, oh, look, they're still terrible people. They're still subjugating their women. But if you saw it from sort of the perspective of the whole coronation and the whole wedding ceremony, it was a very different image.
Yeah.
So we're still doing it.
Tells us a lot about how we see, but not actually very much about what we're seeing. And I think The King and I is a great example. Interestingly, The King and I is banned in Thailand, right?
I will say, my sister and I were there in 1998, and a woman who had been a Thai dancer in Las Vegas, she did Getting to Know You in a production number in Chiang Mai at a theater that my sister and I saw, and they had about 100 children on stage, and I think there were 37 of us in the audience, and they did one number from The King and I. We were very confused, but it happened. So,
oh, that's fascinating. I would love to see. I was thinking as I was watching this afternoon, the great ballet in the second act of The King and I, of course, is the court doing The Small House of Uncle Thomas, a kind of, I don't even know what you would call it. It's Richard Rodgers' sort of pastiche of Pan-Asian clingy-clangy symbols and a strange kind of depiction of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which plays a pretty functional role in the plot. And I was imagining, what would it be like if a bunch of Thai creators took this piece? How would this be different if it were really seeking to reflect something a little more authentic to Thai ballet and music, maybe slightly more authentic than Richard Rodgers was able to present on a Broadway stage in 1951? It's not a part of the show that's aged particularly well, but it's a really interesting example of, in some ways, it's performing race, right? It's Siamese actors portraying African Americans in an African American story, all filtered through the lens of two white composers of mid-century who were very deliberately. Roger said, I wasn't actually able to do actual Thai music because it was too harsh. So I went for a kind of Broadway Asian sound. That was a deliberate choice that Richard Rodgers made. I don't think it's held up particularly well. It's pretty uncomfortable, but a really fascinating, multivalent performance of race in ways that I think are fascinating, but also pretty uncomfortable to watch.
And of course, it's sent up brilliantly, if you like, by the South Park Boys in the Book of Mormon, who take the small house of Uncle Thomas from The King and I and translate it into the African, the Ugandans, telling the story of Mormonism, just interesting to see how that trope gets translated into one of the big musicals of the 21st centuries. And just while we're on Book of Mormon, we might hit it on our last week, but it's an interesting and open question about whether the Book of Mormon can ever be performed again, given its some of the tropes that it sends up post George Floyd and Black Lives Matter.
We've got a few moments. Probably not enough time to go too far into the weeds on Flower Drum Song. Although I'll just sort of mention here, so King and I is 1951. Rogers and Hammerstein go on to write two more flops, Me and Juliet and Pipe Dream, neither shows of which you probably will find a production of anytime soon. They're almost never performed. But then they put together a show called Flower Drum Song with Gene Kelly, actually, the first time Gene Kelly directed a show on Broadway. And we're very insistent. It's a show that has also not aged particularly well, turned into a film in 1961. The first time a Hollywood film had an all-Asian cast, and the only time until The Joy Luck Club in 1993. So a really significant film in terms of how Asian Americans are presented on film, but really trafficking in a lot of, not surprisingly for 1961, a lot of kind of uncomfortable cultural stereotypes. But a very interesting show, reworked almost entirely in 2002, I want to say, by the Chinese-American playwright David Henry Hwang, who basically threw out Hammerstein's script, kept the songs, but reworked the story to kind of get around some of the stuff that has not aged particularly well. And it got mixed reviews. But Flower Drum Song is all about kind of the immigrant experience in America. So really a generation of parents who have immigrated from China and are seeking to hang on to the old ways, and their children, this younger generation, who are nightclub dancers and impresarios and baseball players and are falling in love and seeking to marry the person they love, and the kind of generational conflict between the first generation immigrant and the second generation experience. A very interesting show. So I'll post a clip of a really actually kind of lovely tribute to Flower Drum Song that happened a couple years ago as part of a Broadway fundraiser, where they bring back the original cast and the revival cast is there, and they all sort of talk about what it means to connect with your roots as performers, even when those roots are a little problematic. It's a really beautiful tribute to a kind of problematic show, but a show that was very groundbreaking in its day. Kind of as the Gershwins did with Porgy and Bess, Rogers and Hammerstein were really insistent on finding Asian actors to play Asian roles. They weren't entirely successful. They cast Juanita Hall again, African-American woman, as a Chinese matriarch. So we're doing our best, but we're seeking to do something a little bit closer to what I think we would consider a more contemporary project, right? That the issue of embodiment on stage, who plays the part. We're in kind of a historical moment now where a lot of old assumptions are being rethought, right? Maybe it's not appropriate for white actors to play Asian characters in some weird kind of makeup. That still happens sometimes. It happened at the London Palladium in 2008 when they did The King and I, and you had sort of a mix of British actors and actual Asian actors playing the cast in the show. We'll talk about that again when we get to Hamilton and what it means for deliberately non-white actors to play white characters and what gets amplified and what gets erased. That's a live conversation. But Flower Drum Song becomes a really interesting way of thinking about that question of embodiment. What does it mean to play a role on stage? Do you have to be of the race depicted? Right now, we're kind of in a place culturally where we're saying, yeah, we're going to err on that side. The other half of it is, part of what our thesis for this course is race is always, to a certain degree, a performed phenomenon. So what does it mean for us to see actors on stage who are portraying their own race or somebody else's race? How does that change how we perceive what's happening on stage? I encourage you to go check out Flower Drum Song if you want to explore that idea. Peter, any final thoughts from you before we finish up?
There we go. No, except to say, in terms of the immigrant experience, we sort of pick that up next week with West Side Story, which is really at its core about immigrants into New York, bringing and the warfare that ends up between two rival gangs. And just to contrast that, if I've got our playlist right, Nathan, with the all-white world of The Music Man, which after our discussion so far is going to seem like it seems to me as I think about it, a very strange world now to enter into after we've been on the showboat, and over in the South Pacific, and then to Thailand, and then to the gangs in New York, and then the beautiful day in Iowa with traveling salesmen. So it should be an interesting thing.
You don't think that The Music Man is about race. We're going to try to convince you that The Music Man is actually all about race. It's about the construction of whiteness, and there's hardly a more interesting show to think about the construction of whiteness than a show that's actually just getting ready to be revamped on Broadway in just a few short months here. It continues to be a fulsome source of white identity. So we're going to look at A Music Man next week, and we will see you then, friends. Thanks for being on the call.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.